All right. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
So you see the presentation. Cool. All right. So basically, this is one of the lectures which is kind of important. You have a paper due, which will be replacing the presentation, which you should have been given during the during the classes. Obviously, now there's not going to be any presentation, and I don't think it would be reasonable to do it online. So you basically just submit a paper on the same topic, and one of the topics is going to be urban planning and its economic impact. And that's basically what we're going to talk really quickly today. There's going to be some theory, then there's going to be a few cities which I kind of like used as good examples, kind of like extreme cases, and then we'll talk about Prague a little bit. So basically, first, the welfare economics versus planning. We'll talk about the land market, which happens to be one of the most severely regulated markets. And in this case, it's kind of an unusual market, because normally when you speak, when you study economics, you basically hear about things like perfect competition, or like any other forms of markets. But the regulation in there actually doesn't play such a big role. There's a few exceptions, of course, like weaponry, for example. Obviously not everybody can start producing nuclear weapons, for example. So obviously that market is probably even more regulated than the land market. Or another good example, for example, is healthcare. Obviously not everybody can become a doctor and open a clinic. Not everybody can start producing drugs. So there's quite a few regulations in these markets as well, and they are kind of impacted by that as well. But land market, especially like if I compare it with the healthcare, I would still make a point that land market is still more regulated than that. And well, why it is, we'll get to it in the next slide. Mostly it's because land market is actually a market with the biggest amount of externalities you can ever imagine. Basically everything influences absolutely everything, and because of that, the market needs to be regulated. There's not, the argument is not whether or not. It's basically just about the level of degree of how much it can be regulated, and we'll get to the examples just in a few minutes. So in land markets, basically, obviously it's still a market. So real estate, land has prices, but these prices, they are much less determined by supply and demand, or actually they are quite a lot of influenced by supply and demand, but the regulation is basically causing kind of a havoc in there. And that's kind of a staggering thing, because for most planners, basically for most of people who decide or how city looks like or how market is regulated, they usually don't have economic education. They basically come from they are urbanists and architects, and they more care about if things are nice and not care so much about whether houses are affordable, or how many of them there is. They basically come from a totally different intellectual tradition, and if you just start talking to them about prices, they become a little bit like they don't like that point of view, and they kind of like consider it slightly irrelevant, which obviously is not the best approach to have. So what kind of intervention, what kind of regulation we actually talking about? The problem with land markets is that there is really a lot of examples of market failure. Basically, any piece of land, its price is much more, if you're buying any good in a market, you usually just care about how good that good is. For example, if you buy a new computer, you care about the specifics of the computer much more than anything else. With houses and with pieces of land, you don't usually care about how good that piece of land is. If in a case of house, you might care if it's a nice one or not. But what is actually important, much more important than that, it's location. Like it's not really a coincidence that the real estate brokers, they always say location, 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 because the location actually determines the price much more than anything else. And location so is determined by basically everything, like what's around the houses. Some of the examples are extreme, some of them are like much more subtle. So let's get to the to the extreme ones first. So basically your house, if you happen to own a house, the price of that house is determined by everything which is around. That means, for example, and these effects are basically externalities, because they don't have anything else to do with the good itself. They are basically have to do something with with what's surrounding it. And so, for example, if you own a house and like suddenly city basically just like decides to build a dam, a garbage dam right next to your house, obviously, the value of your house is going to go down. You can kind of easily imagine that. The problem, if you just imagine the situation, the problem with it is that, that effect is unpriced. Nobody, if this happens, nobody will will give you any compensation, or they might, but again, there needs to be a regulation for it to happen. And if you imagine a market which is not regulated, obviously there wouldn't be anything which would stop anybody to build a garbage dam right next to your house, or if they build a factory which pollutes around, if there's a river next to you and there's a factory which pollutes that river which goes by your house, obviously first of all you will not like it, and second of all the value of your property, of the good which you own, which is your house, is going to go down. So that's an example. It's a few examples of negative externalities. There's of course good positive externalities as well. Like if the city basically just decides to build a big park next to your house, well, that's a positive externality, right? If they build a metro next, like in a walking distance to your house, again, a positive externality. Well, not many people are using metro right now, but in normal times, which are not under influence of any pandemic, you would expect that if there's if they built a new metro station, the price of your piece of property will go up. So it's an example of the positive externalities. These externalities, there's basically so many of them. Basically everything which you can imagine is an externality. The crime in your neighborhood, again determined by the location, is a negative externality. How educated your neighbors are, that's a positive externality or negative externality depending on the level. The amount of greenery, I already mentioned that, but that's a big one. That's like a lot of people are deciding depending on that. But also, access to a job market. Obviously, houses in the big cities, they are usually more expensive because they have their location basically gives you an access to a big job market, but also all the other functions which a city provides. That means like bigger culture, bigger variety of shopping, all possible services you might think of. And again, if you own a house in a city, obviously, this is going to be a positive externality on that piece of property, and that's one of the reasons why houses in cities are more expensive. And what's more, they're actually more expensive if you are closer to the city center, because then you're basically dealing with the opportunity cost of commuting. And it really depends of if you have to travel to work every day 20 minutes, or if it's 2 hours, obviously that's a lot of opportunity cost. And again, it's basically given by the location of your piece of property. A special case of externalities is the public goods. I at this moment I usually ask my students if they know what the public good is. So if you can answer, I would be really happy. Well, of course you don't have to.
It can be some buses, transport, also some parks, public.
Exactly. Yeah. Perfect. That's really good. Park is actually exactly what an example of public good. in a public in urban planning, because like there's two conditions for a public good to be a public good. It needs to be non-frivolous, and there can be any way there can be any way to stop somebody using it. So the best examples of public goods we usually use in economics is national defense, basically the army. If there's an attack on your country, if you live in the country, there's nobody which can actually stop you from enjoying the fact that you are protected as the rest of the country. With public goods, with parks, it's exactly worked that same way. First of all, you don't pay for it. So it's public. Nobody can stop you from using it, because unless there is a fence and somebody charges admission, or would prevent you from entering, nobody can actually do that. And also, by enjoying that good, you are not interfering with all the other people which are enjoying it as well, unless the park, for example, gets overcrowded, which then obviously, like you can see, it's not a perfect public good, but it's pretty close to it. And another, the last example of market failure, which I'm going to mention in urban planning, it's the infrastructure projects, which basically, of course, infrastructure projects, for example, a railway or a road. Unfortunately, there's a way how to kind of play with that market, because obviously the people who sell their pieces of land, they have a much bigger bargaining power. So the market doesn't really work that way that perfectly in there. I just want to mention this example of a market failure just so you know about it, but it's actually not so, we'll actually not talk about it now in the theory. So let's get to the first few cases of let's go to the charts, and I'll basically now, on a very simple model, I'm going to explain how the regulation basically works, and how does it how should it achieve something like socially optimal equilibrium, and sometimes how it doesn't. So this is an example. It's basically it's a chart taken from one of the readings, and it basically shows an equilibrium in unregulated market for residential land. Basically, this is a market where there's no regulation. You can imagine it as a model of very small town, which basically just keeps growing, and and as such, it doesn't really provide any public goods. Like, for example, parks. So imagine it as a market where there is no, as a city where there is no parks, and obviously people like parks. That's basically what makes cities livable. But in a market where there's no regulation, there won't be no parks, right? Just maybe to explain this a little bit more, you can imagine it. If you imagine that there is a town when there's no urban planning, and the neighbors, they just don't decide to actually build a park, then obviously there wouldn't be any, right? Because any all the land is privately owned, and that means that every time there's a piece of greenery, what can happen is somebody built a house in there, and obviously interferes with the enjoyment of greenery of everybody who already lives in the town. So you basically, on this chart, you can see my mouse by any chance? Can you just quickly confirm that you can see my mouse?
Yes.
Oh, sweet, perfect. So over here we have basically the quantity of land which is in the town, and this is the price of the land. And basically, as the town keeps growing, there's more and more land converted into residential land, and we are talking about only private costs. So marginal private cost is basically our supply line. It's perfectly horizontal because, as the town like grows, basically the conversion of any piece of land to a construction land basically just takes, two factors. First of all, you have to build infrastructure, which is kind of a set cost. It probably doesn't matter if it's going to where is it going to happen. So that's a fixed cost. And second, that you have a dealing with opportunity cost of, agricultural land. That means like you will not use that land for agriculture anymore. It means you can grow anything on it, and that's a foregone profits. So basically, as you building the city, the conversion of the land basically costs the same amount. So that's our supply line. And the demand for housing, that's nicely downward sloping curve. And here at the point L, it's an equilibrium. Obviously, as the city grows and there's no parks, people like to enjoy the greenery. But if the town is small, then they have to walk to the edge of the city a little bit, and that includes a little bit of a of a commuting cost. That means opportunity cost. So basically the town grows with any regulation to cultivate to point L. So there's some drilling happening outside. I don't know if it interferes with what you hear or not. I can't really stop it. And obviously, if it goes all the way to the point L, there is this unpriced component of what people would be willing to pay, but they can't because there's nobody actually providing any greenery. And that situation is basically signified by this curve M, marginal social costs over here, and the difference between this line, the marginal personal cost and marginal social cost, is basically what would people be willing to pay for greenery if it was actually something you can pay for, which in normal cities you can. There's no developer which would be providing parks. So you can see that basically what happens is that the city grows a little bit more than it probably should. You can kind of intuitively think that the equilibrium should be somewhere over here. But that's not going to happen because this triangle over here is unpriced. That's not something you can buy. But the city grows all the way over here. This is the cost of the land on which houses are being built. But obviously for everybody else, everybody in that little town is probably a little bit worse off because, well, they have to walk quite a far away to get to the green areas to enjoy the public good. And they would be willing to pay for it if there was a way how. And this is the example of public failure. Basically, what you get is, the land is cheaper. There's more of it is provided, but people are not enjoying it as much as they would actually do it if the market failure didn't occur, which would be here at this point. So what can you do about it? Well, there's two ways how to internalize externalities. Usually in economics you hear about it, and one of them is to regulate the market. The second one is to tax it. Both of them do exactly the same thing. They basically, so for example, if I'm going to take the tax approach, which is actually never used anywhere, but if I use the tax approach first, basically what it does is it basically raises this a horizontal supply line up to the point P2. And what you get is, obviously the equilibrium is going to be somewhere else. It's going to be here at the point G, which means you would basically get to roughly where you want it to be. That means, people are willing to pay a slightly higher price for public goods, which in the unregulated market they are not allowed to do. I don't know how familiar you are with interpreting these macroeconomics charts, but basically what you usually hear about is that this is the consumer surplus. This is the producer's surplus, and this is the tax, which obviously as any tax, this EIKG, rectangular. It's a money which is collected on tax and can be spent on something else, which goes back to the consumer, which basically means that, like, at the end, this whole thing will be the consumer surplus. GKL triangle. It's a dead weight loss. You can't really do anything about that, but the market is basically at the equilibrium which it should be. The result of this situation is the houses get more expensive, because suddenly the land costs more, doesn't cost P1, costs P2. Because of it, less of it is going to be provided, but at the same time, people are willing to pay for it because it gives them like access to greenery. Obviously, like this the money which is spent on the cost, on the tax, can be used for something, and like sometimes people, like economists interpret like that it has a kind of like an additional effect, but we're not going to talk about that. I'll be just happy if you understand what I said so far. So this is what happens when you tax the market. If you regulate the market, it basically means instead of like preventing the city to grow by taxing it, but you basically say only this much can be built. You basically achieve the same result with one big difference. You don't collect anything on taxes, but this surplus, which is over here, still exists. But who's going to get it? People who own the land at that moment when the regulation is established actually get the surplus, and they basically become richer because suddenly the land which they owned is not worth P1, it's worth P2. And it's a kind of it can be kind of like a substantial difference, basically. So you can imagine something a little bit more tangible in this. Basically, if you imagine any city which suddenly like makes its urban planning a little bit more restrictive, basically say not this much houses can be built, but only this many houses can be built. Basically, what happens is that everybody who owns houses at that very moment become richer, because that regulation basically like interferes with the supply and demand, and because you make the the good which people want to buy, if you make it more scarce, obviously the price goes up, in this case from P1 to P2. And that's kind of like a perverse incentive, because in many cities what we actually see is that the local residents who already live there, they basically want to regulate the amount of housing provided, and they want to decrease the numbers, because they get richer. Obviously, like quite often they don't even realize it. They basically say like, hey, we want to keep our houses as they are. We want the city to keep us as it is, but they actually have a huge incentive, because let's say the job market of the city is working well, people want to move in, and if that city doesn't provide housing, the prices go up. And unfortunately, the urban planning is kind of pervasive in this way that it can like really efficiently regulate how many houses are being built, and that's kind of interfering with the with the prices quite a lot. So this is what I show you. Obviously, like this example, we would basically get to P2, which we consider our social equilibrium, which would be good. But what actually happens in most of the cities is that that increase doesn't go from P1 to P2, but much higher to P3. And what you basically see is that the death weight loss is way larger than like what it could have been. And obviously the consumer surplus has decreased as well. Even the tax doesn't even compensate for it. But like if this is actually given by a regulation, it basically means that everybody who owned the houses at this moment, basically get a huge, property value boost. but everybody who comes into the market basically has to be only very rich to actually afford the houses, and only very like the surplus for the consumers is like diminished by it. Any questions to this? No. So I'm just going to skip this. We'll talk about a few markets. First of them is it's what's happening in London. During our lectures, I mentioned a few times, that like in London they have something called Green Belt. And it's kind of relevant to what I was just talking about, about the green area and stuff. In London, there is, they basically have a regulation which basically puts limits on how large London can actually grow to the side. Basically, they basically decided to stop the suburbanization by establishing what you see on this picture, which is the green belt. And that's basically a land where nobody can build. It's like, all construction is forbidden up there, and the reason for it was that, like, that the local politicians, they basically liked the idea that like they would stop all suburbanization, and all this area around London would be protected as a green area, which sounds objectively as a nice idea. You would not complain if if you live in a city next somewhere close to really a lot of green areas. The problem is that it actually, like, London doesn't have only suburbanization rules. It also has a density rules. It also has a height rules. That means that London basically it prevented from almost any construction anywhere, and basically like limited the supply of new housing, like, to a large extent. Because of that, basically London's houses are really tiny, and I'll get to it in a second, and really expensive. Like, compared, for example, to Washington, D.C., per meter square, the houses are about 4 times more expensive. And it's all basically given by the fact that London is a prosperous city. There is a huge financial center, but, like, not only that, a lot of people would want to come to London and work there and make a lot of money. But, because houses are so expensive that, like, basically, like, that is like a added productivity of London is basically is being eaten out by the high housing costs. So that's basically an example of when I was talking about, like, when the supply is restricted way too much, you basically get from P1 all the way to P3, and suddenly the price is like, if you compare it with unregulated market to regulated market, it's, in this case, it's about 2.5 times. In London's case, like, there were researchers who actually calculated this what would be the difference between if the market was unregulated and what it would be regulated. For central London, that amount is about 8 times. That means, like, basically people pay for their houses about 8 times more than what they could do if the market was unregulated. Obviously, nobody actually wants unregulated market for all the reasons I mentioned, all the externalities. You don't want just, like, your neighbors to do whatever they want. But it's really important that you don't overdo it, basically. You basically like manage the growth of the city somehow reasonably, so it's livable at the same time it's affordable. There's basically, the charts which I showed you, they are basically showing that there's a trade-off between affordability and livability. And you can kind of observe it in many cities. Like, you can always see that the cities which are really expensive, they are also quite nice. You can imagine yourselves living them. But one of the reasons why they are so nice is that they basically, like, like, prevent and tax and all the new developments. On the other hand, then you have cities, like, which are extremely cheap, and they are not really, but they are also not regulated, and like living in them is not so great. Like, you know, us, like one of like best examples, I usually mentioned Houston or Phoenix, both of the United States, which have extremely lenient regulation. There's not so much of greenery provided. You know, they are extremely dispersed, but they are very cheap. So this trade-off kind of holds. You know, like the nicer the city is, the usually it's more expensive, and like quite often it's because of the regulation. So in London, they basically, like, you know, decided to keep all of this area, you know, unregulated. Yeah, sorry, regulated, basically, in a sense that nobody can build anything on it. Because of that, the costs have grown really rapidly. Uh, Less people have moved to London because of it. Many people actually live in towns which are like outside of London and commute like really long periods of time to London and back, just because, you know, the cities which are around, you know, they basically don't have the green belts and they don't prevent it. But you know, just imagine spending like 2 hours a day to commute back to London and back, quite often even more. It's these green belts, they are kind of symptomatic for United Kingdom. You can see that Oxford or Cambridge over here, they both also have their own, you know, little green belts, and it's not something which is unusual in United Kingdom. There's basically a lot of towns have it. There were even some ideas about establishing green belt in Prague, but I hope that that's never going to realize, because it's just one of the it's one of the silliest approaches you can ever choose. You know, you have to protect greenery, but you can't just do it in, like, you know, in areas which are 3 times as big as the city itself. You know, you can also probably imagine the impact on like a GDP and who actually makes money, because in city like London, basically, like there's a lot of talented professionals going to London. You know, there's basically the highest like amount of educated and talented people who work in London. The problem is that, you know, their salaries, which are really high, they are basically being taken by people who originally owned the houses, and they are not the ones who, you know, who should benefit from this situation. People who should be benefiting from the situation is the people who are talented, and they just like want to work in companies which are productive. So obviously, like, you know, it basically also means that this regulation basically redistributes wealth to people who were originally already wealthy. So that's not ideal. Another case which we're going to talk about is Brussels, and that's I chose that example because that's kind of like an opposite extreme to London here in the European context. So basically, in Brussels, their regulation is kind of lenient, especially if you look at the urban sprawl. That means how wide the city can grow, like, you know, if it can grow to the side. Also, the regulation is somehow like liberal in a sense that, you know, they basically just like they don't over-regulate. They have like you know, just a few functions of like what the land can be used, and that basically makes construction much easier. And, you know, the urban sprawl, which was experienced in Brussels, you know, basically resulted in lower prices, but also, you know, like a lot of capacity, a lot of pressure on the capacity of the roads. So this is a slide which was taken from one of the, you know, like ecological agencies. Obviously, like, you know, they use kind of threatening numbers for the sprawl. They like to use the city, like, you know, the city is all bright red, so like, you know, people will get kind of freaked out by how like, you know, they would like emotively consider it as a problem. So you can see basically in between 1955 and 2006, you know, the Brussels kind of experienced a lot of sprawl, and which means that a lot of people are moved to the suburbs, and basically a whole new towns were built around Brussels, which had a major result in because well, people could still afford living in houses. You know, people could still afford houses, so a lot of people moved in. which is definitely a good thing. And Brussels actually needed a lot because, as an unofficial capital city of European Union, it experienced a lot of pressure into on its job market because a lot of people were coming in. So a lot of the supply of the housing needed to be provided. At the same time, Brussels and Belgium kind of mismanaged severely the infrastructure demands of such expansion. So living in Brussels is actually really complicated because if you live like somewhere far away from the center, commuting to Brussels and back is actually really difficult. Takes a lot of time, and the infrastructure is definitely lacking, and Brussels is not managing its expansion so well as it could be. There was one example of the Czech embassy. They actually they needed to move a lot of people to Brussels, so they needed a residence. So they built a castle, quite close to Brussels, and they basically reconstructed it. And hope that people will be just commuting from the castle, to Brussels and back. But then they found out that the commute actually takes about 4 hours in the morning because all the highways are stuck. They are congested. So that obviously didn't work so well. So Czech embassy at the end ended up selling that castle, which was brand new reconstructed because it was worthless to him. So and another case which we're talking about is Netherlands. So Netherlands, it's kind of in between the two. Its zoning is very detailed but very restrictive. They basically have plan like they have like a sectional functional categories as basically like any other country. Instead of green belt, they have something called green heart. Which is basically area between the four major cities in Netherlands. That means Amsterdam, The Hague, Rotterdam, Utrecht, and this area in between is like protected from building, but there is actually quite a lot of leeway around, and also building in these other areas you can kind of see that the little towns are kind of slowly connecting, but even there it's kind of difficult to build. But what Amsterdam actually at least does is they have something called Dutch Housing Demand Survey, which basically they try to estimate how much demand there can be, and they basically just say, hey, this much land can be used for construction, so we don't see any upwards pressures on prices, and people can still afford it. Nonetheless, housing in the Netherlands is still much more expensive than it used to be, and you can make a really clear-cut argument that it's because there's just not enough of places to be built on, even though they're trying to estimate it in such a way. The regulation still impacts prices no matter what. The most reasonable approach, which I found, and they in the meantime, it's actually not in the force anymore, but the city kind of looks like it because of it. This is an urban plan of Copenhagen in Denmark, and it's called a finger plan of Copenhagen, and it's because they basically said we will not have a green belt, we'll have places in between fingers which are going to be preventing for will basically prevent developers to build anything on these lands between the fingers, but there can be any construction in these what they call fingers, and you can see that they are closely related to the major transporting links. That means railways and highways. So basically they said we need the city to grow, but we want all the residents to have access to greenery. At the same time, we need all the new people to get efficiently back, to the city center and back, because that's where most of the jobs are. So they basically said construction is allowed only around these fingers, so people can get on the train and commute to the central Copenhagen kind of efficiently, and it's basically what happened. Houses were built along these links. The city was expanding to all sides, but these fingers, they were like, they were like allowed, like they were basically prevented from being built on. And so like most of the people who live in these fingers, obviously it's really easy to get to the green areas. But also it's fairly easy to get to the city center. But Denmark also had like quite a lot of regulating rents, which we can kind of intuitively see as economists. You may intuitively understand regulating any prices is always a bad idea because it causes mismatch between price and between prices and between demand and supply. So at the end, what happens is that the developers basically supply less housing and the prices go up, and only the people who originally get the regulated housing, they are basically the winners in the situation, and everybody else is a loser. There was a deregulation of regulating of the regulations on prices of rents in the meantime, but there were quite a lot of especially in the original center, there was a lot of areas which were kind of run down because the landlords, they were just basically refusing to reconstruct their places because there was no financial incentive in doing it, because they always knew that if you own a house and you can't increase rent, and that there's always going to be somebody who will want your house because it's so cheap, why would you reconstruct it? There's no incentive to do it. And because of that, after if you have a city where they have regulated rents, after a while, what you see is that the houses, they just look worse and worse and worse and worse because nobody keeps maintaining them. So that's exactly what happened in Denmark. So their urban planning was kind of reasonable, but this point definitely wasn't. But the access to greenery, it's actually well thought through, because what I actually forgot to mention here in the case of London is this is a protected greenery, but this is UK and all of the land is privately owned, and in UK anybody who owns private land has a right to fence it. You might kind of see big difference between, for example, what we have here in Czech Republic or in Germany or even in Netherlands and Denmark, because here in Czech Republic we have a law which prevents people from fencing their private lands if they are not used for residential purposes or industrial purposes. So in Czech Republic, if you own a forest, you can't fence it around. It means you can't prevent people from entering your forest. Obviously there's law which prevents how people can behave in your forest, but you can't stop them from entering it. In London or in UK, and for that matter in the United States, it's also the case. There's you can really efficiently prevent anybody from entering your land, which means that this whole of this green areas which are around London are actually to no use to anybody except of their owners, because they're all fenced in. There's fence around, and which basically stops anybody going in and enjoying it. So now I'm going to just quickly go to how is it done in Czech Republic. This is a zoning plan of Prague. Can you just quickly confirm that you see it again?
Yes.
Sweet, perfect. So so basically, this is a zoning plan of Prague. Right now, I'm looking. This is the area of our school. Czech Republic and Prague has one of the most regulated markets there is in the world, actually. I'm looking at these plans for for quite a few years, for about 10 years now, and I've never seen anything more complicated than what Prague has. Prague has over 50 categories of what the land can be used for. Again, we are talking about private land, so basically it means that if you own a land, and you just want to build a house on it, obviously, it really depends on what category, on one of the 50 categories which the land is zoned for. So, for example, our school, which is over here, you can see that it's zoned for something which is called the ZVS, which is actually a category for vysoké školy or universities. The land which the university is used for can't be used for anything else than a university. And changing it requires application, which takes on average about 8 years to be changed. So you can kind of immediately see that this market is probably heavily influenced by how is it regulated. And just so and that's just one of the examples. The problem with this is, for example, if our school had too many students, let's say, and wanted to buy a building next door, which is which is, let's say, they wanted to buy this piece of land which is zoned for another public purpose, which is offices, but like public offices. Then it would have to buy the land, then apply for the permit to change the zoning, which would take about 8 years. And it's uncertain if it's going to happen, and then apply for the construction permits, which will take another few years, and then building in a few years. So in the best case scenario, University of Economics would be able to expand in about 15 years, and obviously that's not going to happen. So that's why we have a few campuses, one of them in Jižní Město, because building there was comparatively much easier. That's definitely not the most efficient way how to do it. Just to another regulation which is kind of prevalent in Czech Republic, you can see that even this area, which is all basically residential, it's just under Seifertova Street. You can see that there's two different colors. This is a pure residential, and this is a mixed use. This mixed use basically means that you can have shops in the ground floor. If you go one street over, you find out that there can't be any shops in the ground floor. There are some exceptions to it, but they are difficult again to apply to. So these streets, these houses, they can have shops in the ground floor, and these over here can't. Again, changing it is extremely difficult and takes years and years and years. What I want you to understand when I talk about this is this is definitely the most, we are still talking about the market, right? You basically want people to kind of, see a house and think, okay, maybe I can build a shop in here, and maybe this location will actually work for it. And that the person who has a lot of energy and time and would want to realize its own potential and potential of his idea finds out, okay, maybe in 8 years I can actually try something like that. The market has any market has that the great quality of it, that it basically provides incentive of realizing profits and realizing business ventures. If you have a market which is so heavily regulated, it basically prevents all of these things from happening. And of course, if you stick to it and you wait 8 years and open a shop, and it turns out that there's a huge undersupply of shops in that area, obviously, you make killing, you make a lot of money, but it's all at the expense of all the consumers which could have used your shop in the meantime, and they will do it at a higher price because of the restricted supply again. So basically, if you have a market like this, the market is basically not allowed to react to price signals which it generates. So that if there is a demand for something in one area, providing supply takes years and years and years. And it's not only because this plan is so complicated, it's also because our other permits, that means planning permit and construction permit, they take years themselves. So for a developer to actually build something, it usually takes years, up to 10 years. To actually even start building anything. So obviously, in such a market, you can see that supply and demand matching is not the most efficient. And basically what we see here is a very low elasticity of supply. So basically, demand goes up and down depending on, like, if the economy is growing. So in times when there's a lot of growth, the people are coming to Prague. They are employed in jobs, but the housing market is not able to provide supply of the housing quickly, which basically means that there is this like a low supply so low elasticity of supply basically results in a huge volatility in prices, which we actually see in Prague quite a lot. That we can basically see that the houses are getting like way too expensive when the economy is growing, and when there's a recession, they just fell down like really outrageously as well, because suddenly all of the loans which people took to buy expensive houses are like not workable and they need to sell. So basically what I want you to understand is this this like overregulating of the market results in mismatch between supply and demand, but also low elasticity of supply, which basically causes a huge volatility in prices. And and then of course in Prague there's a lot of areas which are not like we have like a piece of land which like closest to you might be probably the Žižkovské nádraží, the Žižkov train station, which you might know because some of you might have lived nearby at Jarov. So over here, I believe over here are the colleges, are the dormitories of VŠE, and this whole area of land over here, it's the old train station in Žižkov, which was basically an industrial train station at the time when it was when a lot of goods were taken in and out of Prague using trains, which obviously like is it's a technology which is not really used in such a scale for basically 50 years now. So this old train station basically lays there empty, and it was there was something called there was a law which basically prevented developers from using that land for last 25 years because Prague just couldn't agree on what should be built in there. Now you can see that if you are familiar with these plans, you would see that this like a prevention from building anything on that land is not there anymore, and there's like even a train like a metro station plan in there, and this whole thing is going to be like a residential area in the future. But the developers who own it now had to sit on the land for 55 years, and they still don't get. And even now, when like this is not there, this prevention is not there anymore, they still don't get even their planning permits to actually build anything on it. So in the best case, the developer actually had to wait about 30 years to actually build anything on the land, and you can see that that's causing a lot of problems in markets like housing market in Prague. That developer basically has to own something before using it for 30 years. This case is actually the most further along. There's another one here in Bubny. This darker line over here means that still nobody can actually use it for construction, and that's also case old about 25 years, and they still didn't agree of what's going to be built in there. There's yet another plan. There's basically the story is always the same. There's a new city council which basically throws out the old plans. They start preparing new ones. It takes a few years to even prepare ideas. Then there's election, new city council, and they throw everything out of the window, and we just like continue going on and on like this. There's a few of these places in Prague. This one in Bubny, which is like right next to Holešovice. There's one in Strahov. There used to be one in there still is actually part of it is in Smíchov, the old train station. They actually allowed construction in this area now here, but this part is still closed for any future construction. It's 11 o'clock. So I'm going to finish the lecture. I hope it wasn't total waste of time for you. This is a kind of important lecture because like your paper is due on 15th of April, I believe, and like this is one of the topics of which you can choose for your own city, of course. So at least you might you might find it helpful in what you going to write about yourself. Any questions? All right, if there's no questions, so I would like to thank you for your attention. And well, next lecture, I'm going to send you all an invite, but it's going to be on like in our normal time. Actually, it's going to be in the time of the seminar. That means like we'll do it on Wednesday between 4:30 and 5:45. I hope it's going to be all right with everybody. Yeah, so that's it. And yeah, I thank you very much for your attention and see you on. Maybe very last question. Did anybody of you had a problem connecting?
No.
No, everything was fine. Thank you.
Everything was fine. Perfect. So in that
Yeah.
case, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you all on Wednesday.
Thank you. See you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.